Okay, so let's talk about CSS and why we're using CSS. Remember at the beginning of the class, we talked about how for your content, that's what we're going to be using HTML for, and that's what we've been learning so far in the class. Your level 1 headers, level 2 headers, paragraph lists, that's how to organize and structure your content with HTML markup. Now we're turning our attention to CSS so that we can start adding some style, some presentation to our HTML, to our content. But I guess what I want to ask you, what I want to talk about with you today is why. Why we have to learn a brand new language like CSS just so that we can add style and presentation. Because as some of you have already played around with a little bit, you've seen that you can use HTML attributes to style and add style, color, change the font of your content with HTML itself. So why learn CSS? Well, here's the deal. Let's say we've got a website that we're working on that's got hundreds and hundreds of pages. So let me just draw out a few of those hundreds and hundreds of pages. Okay. Each of these is just a regular old HTML page. Okay, now we're getting used to seeing these. And each one of them has somewhat different content. We'll have H1 tags, and we'll have P tags, and we'll have H1, H1P, right? Maybe we'll have H1, H2, who knows? It doesn't really matter. We're just going to kind of represent a bunch of content here. Okay. Now, for those of you that were playing around with using the HTML for your presentation, what did you find out? Well, if you were putting in attributes for your P tags, for example, you wanted all your paragraphs, let's say we're looking at the second page here, all your paragraphs to look the same. Well, you added attributes to your paragraph tag, and in order to make the second paragraph tag look exactly the same, you had to add those same attributes to your everywhere that you had a P tag in your code. So you are doing a lot of copying and pasting there. And as soon as you copy and paste something, that's a copy of something that's going to need to be maintained if you're planning on making any changes to the site. So let's say you went through this whole page and you finally had all your P tags set up with matching attributes, so they all were font of 12 with a nice cyan blue color with a sans serif font. You had it perfectly set up, and then someone came along and said, oh, you know what, I don't like that color blue, I think you should change it to be purple. Guess what, you're going through, and for every one of these attribute tags, you're changing the attribute to be the new color. That's a lot of work for one change on one page. And then you're talking about several paragraphs on one page and several pages in one website. That's a lot of work for one very simple change, right? That's why we look at CSS. That's why we start seeing the power of CSS. Because with CSS, what we can do is, for this one page, we can actually use what's called a style tag and set up CSS rules so that all of my paragraphs on this page follow a certain set of rules. And while we're at it, all of my level 1 headers follow a certain set of rules as well. So I can have CSS rules for all of my pages in this style tag inside of my header, so that each page knows, without having to go through separate attributes and set up for each piece of content, I set up rules. So I say, okay, for every paragraph on this page, you're going to make it a specific font, a specific color, a specific alignment, whatever else you want to set up. Same for H1 headers, same for any other element that you might have on the page. Okay. However, what happens again? What happens if we decide we need to change something about that presentation? And we've got 100 pages on our website. Guess what? We're still needing to go through 100 times, once for each page, to update my CSS rule, right? So I'm going to have a rule that needs to be updated on every single one of these HTML pages. That, again, is still a lot of work. It saves us a little time because we're not having to maintain and make the change in every single attribute of the page, but still we're touching every single page, and that's a lot. Okay, so what's our option then with CSS? We have the option of, instead of using this header style tag with the CSS rules, we can use an external style sheet. So we can make a .css file, and this is my external style sheet. It has my .css at the end of it, and in here, guess what? I'm going to have my rules for paragraph. I'm going to have my rules for my level 1 headers, my rules for my level 2 headers, and so on. So I don't have to have these style tags in my separate pages anymore. My HTML files are seriously just content. These rules no longer exist here because they all exist in my external style sheet. Okay? But we can't just have we can't just have HTML pages and a style sheet and hope that the styles from the CSS page get inherited by our HTML pages, right? We actually have to link the two. So in our header, we're going to use a link that points to, a link element that points to my .css. And that's going to be what I need to add to every single one of my HTML pages so that it points to my same CSS file. So each one of these in the header is going to have a link element that points to this .css. Okay, so the benefit there, suddenly, guess what? Yep, that same change comes along, and I have to make a change to all of my H2 headers. I actually don't want them to be 12-point font. I want them to be bigger. They're going to be 16-point font. Now, instead of going through each H2 attribute and changing the attribute so that it's the correct size on each page in each attribute, I don't have to touch each page by changing a CSS rule. All I have to do is change one rule right here. And suddenly, I'm making a change to my whole website. Hundreds and hundreds of pages have just changed by me changing one rule in one file. So you see how just by editing the one style sheet page, I can make changes to hundreds of pages at once. That's why CSS is so powerful. That's why it's such a time saver, and that's why we're learning it.